Hello everyone and welcome to the 30-second daily critique where I'm going to be discussing 5 images by Alasdair Neill. These are all images of the Scottish Highlands. We've got 4 panoramas and 1 landscape image, but there's a variety of things to discuss, so no specific theme again for this episode, but we're going to cover composition and editing like normal. So let's get started. Here are the images that Alasdair sent in, taken from all over the Scottish Highlands. I've actually had some difficulty opening this 5th image in Photoshop. There's some issue with the file, so we'll have to discuss that in Lightroom. But before we do that, let's go through these first 4 images. And we'll start with this one, which is of the Buckle in Glencoe or Buccleuch of Moor. And it is really a fantastic mountain, very prominent, great to photograph from any angle really. I mean, down the bottom here, and also from the mountain opposite where this is taken, which is called Benacrulist. It's also fantastic hiking. I came up here in the winter actually, which is quite an exciting route when there's lots of snow around. So there's some photos from that on my blog if you're interested. And there's some nice scrambling and climbing routes up here, none of which I've done, but which I'd certainly like to do. So fantastic mountain and nicely composed this. There's the right amount of asymmetry. Obviously, the mountain itself is the star of the show, and it's heavily weighted to the right-hand side of the image. But the hills on the left do hold their own from a balance perspective. So I think that the amount of asymmetry is exactly right. So it's well composed in that respect. People who shoot from this hill, which has become increasingly popular over the last 5 years in particular, will generally include the river that is just below here. So it's maybe half the height of the mountain below, and it does frame it rather nicely. But it's nice to see this alternative as a panorama, and perhaps that's the right decision in this particular case, with the light just catching the top halves of the mountain here, because otherwise you would have a massive shadow in the image, which perhaps wouldn't work so well. I do think that the edit is perhaps a little bit dark. I think part of that is probably that a grad was used, because it looks like the light on top of the mountain is lighter than lower down, and the shadow here is also darker than at the bottom of the mountain. And I'm not sure that using a grad in this particular circumstance, if that's what was used, was the best idea, simply because it's difficult to remove, and I think it would be preferable to have brighter highlights on top of the mountain. You can do it, but it's all a bit hacky, because you kind of have to do a reverse grad, which obviously makes no sense, to kind of make the edit consistent first, so that the shadows at the bottom are similar to those at the top, and then you need to do a brightening adjustment. And really you want to be doing this in Lightroom, incidentally, because you've got better controls there. And then you could mask out the top of the sky. In fact, instead of using luminosity masks, I generally do a select color range, and I will select, I've got a whole range of colors selected already here. Yeah, so actually this doesn't work so well, because the colors in the sky are quite similar to those tones in the ground. Oh no, okay, there we go, that's better. So you can make a selection that way and tidy things up a bit. And if I invert that, then you can see how you can lift the brightness of the mountain. And I'd then come in here and I would just paint white over anything that's in the foreground and black over anything that's in the sky. But I won't spend the 1 minute or so that it takes to do that. And yeah, I generally look to brighten this image up a bit more, and that's generally the case with a lot of these images. They're just a little bit dark, and maybe that's a monitor issue that Alasdair has. I'm not sure, but yeah, I'd brighten things up, and I'd probably saturate this a little bit more just to bring some of that color back. But you can see just how dark the original is by comparison, and that's very important when it comes to printing. So I'll just discuss that brightness issue with this shot quickly before we go into the composition. So I'm setting a white point here, and I don't mind the top of the mountain clipping 2 color channels there, because I want it to look nice and bright and white. So that's happening to the entire image. Then I'm going to do a second adjustment and set a white point for pretty much everywhere else other than the sky and the snow. So I'm allowing those to clip, and then I'm going to create a really large soft black brush and paint away those areas very approximately. And as long as you use a very large soft edged brush, it's very unlikely that you're going to see the actual edge of where you've painted. So if I do a before and after there, you can see just how much I've brightened the image up. It's really quite significant. And what that allows you to do is see all the colours and the contrast that naturally exists in the image. And you can maybe add a bit of contrast as well, because it's important to keep the relative brightnesses within an image. I mean, you want this mountain to look like it's in the sun, and you can only achieve that if you keep the shadows dark enough. But you can still lift them to a certain degree, which is what this adjustment does. So they'll still look like shadows, but you can see into them a bit better. The colours are better in other areas of the image as well. So generally, I would suggest editing as bright as you can, as long as you're not washing out colours and creating an excessively bright image. And if you were really worried about the loss of detail in this part of the mountain, then you can come in and start to just affect that area very locally. So this is a 50% brush I'm painting with now, and I could just do something like this just to make sure that I don't lose too much of that detail. So that's how I would edit the image differently, just to lift everything. Now, talking about the composition, this is a really difficult view to shoot well, I would imagine. I mean, I have no easy answers here, and I did look at this for a while and think, how would I crop this differently? Does it help to, for example, lose some of the left and lose some of the right? And I was never quite happy with whatever crops I tried. So I mean, I think I would lose some off the left, maybe not quite that much, but this symmetrical framing is quite nice. And I think you just want a more continuous ridge there, because this sunlit snow-covered peak is quite clearly the strongest focal point in the image, and yet it doesn't quite feel dominant enough to hold its own, so to speak. And just thinking off the top of my head now, I'm wondering if a tighter view generally would have worked better. So if you maybe lose some foreground, then maybe you can start to make that work a bit better, because then you do make the peak larger. So maybe that does work better actually from a compositional standpoint. But really nice image that from the Grey Corries, which I've not visited, not far from Ben Nevis. I'd hoped to go there this winter, but ran out of time. So looking at this one from Loch Broom, let's do our white point trick again and see how the colours are lifted. And you can kind of add a bit more contrast as well by doing that. So you can see just how that brightens things up and effectively saturates the colour. Good little tip there. I've considered shooting this view before because it's not far from Ullapool, and I've been to Ullapool a gazillion times. But one of the things I don't like so much about this area is that the view across the loch is all quite linear. All the lines are very straight. And I think that when you're shooting this, you're always battling with that problem. The peak in the distance also isn't really that prominent or interesting, and certainly not at this distance. It's not helped by the fact, of course, that you've just got all this high ground right next to it, so it loses any sense of prominence that it would otherwise have had. So it's not the most interesting subject there in the background. There's nothing interesting about the loch itself, in my opinion. And unfortunately, this foreground is rather distracting, particularly this sunlit rock. So it may be that there are opportunities to make a successful image looking across at this mountain, but I would suggest that you don't make the view the star of the show, and instead try to look for a really interesting structured foreground, which is often harder than it seems. I mean, you may just end up wasting a load of time trying to get water from a stone, so to speak. Okay, on to the fourth image, and this is a really wonderful composition. It does happen to follow the rule of thirds. I'm not one who really advocates for the rule of thirds, but I did notice that this one kind of does that job near enough. So the rule of thirds is the idea that if you split the image into thirds like this, you put your focal points on the intersections as much as possible, and then have any horizons running on the thirds as well, which you can see all kind of works with this image. I mean, for example, the tops of the trees coincide with the third, and so does the approximate mountain ridge line, and obviously the peak and tree. So it all fits into that rule fairly well. I think that's probably more by coincidence, but it does show that the rule of thirds can create nice balanced compositions. I tend to take the rule of thirds as don't put things in the middle unless the subject you're shooting has a good sense of symmetry, or putting your subject in the middle creates a sense of impact. So central compositions can actually be very effective sometimes, but generally not. Generally some level of asymmetry is favourable, and this works well in that respect. It's also a good opportunity to talk about balance. Lone trees like this are a great chance to play around with the relative scale of your subjects. So the only way you can change the size of this mountain in the frame is to zoom in on it, use a longer focal length. But as you do that, the composition would start to fall apart. So what you could do is walk backwards and slightly to the left. So keep the tree, for example, the same scale within the frame, but make the mountain bigger because you're walking backwards and zooming in. So you can then do the reverse, which is to walk closer to the tree, shoot at a wider angle, and make the mountain look smaller. So you can control the scale, the size of the mountain, the visual dominance of the tree and the mountain combination just by changing your position and focal length. So I'd encourage anybody to practice with that idea and get it in your head as a fundamental concept of composition, that you can control the scale of your subjects. And I think the balance that Alasdair's found here is absolutely perfect. The lighting is a bit flat, but the colours are wonderful, and I think it's maybe one that I would come back for to find in better lighting, actually, because it certainly has an enormous amount of potential. And I like the heavy clouds, heavy set clouds. But I just think it would be better if there was a greater degree of separation potentially between the foreground and the background, or some nice light to break things up a bit. So on to the fifth and final image, which I couldn't open in Photoshop. There's one really weird aspect about this shot, and that's the green in the sky, which I assumed had been introduced at the edit stage, but actually it exists in all the raw files. So I had a go at reassembling a panorama and re-editing it, so maybe we can just compare the two. But the green is not Alasdair's fault, which I assumed initially it was, but it's not. It's there in the raws. I've possibly added a little bit too much magenta now to get rid of those greens in the sky, but this is more how I would edit this image, and you can see that I've edited it to be much brighter, and I don't want to spend too much time going through exactly how I edited this, but it is just a straight Lightroom edit and nothing particularly clever about it. Lifting, in fact, let's just very quickly go into the develop module so you can see some of the changes that I've made. So I've boosted the shadows, darkened the highlights, and added some contrast to compensate, and then adjusted the exposure to get the approximate brightness I wanted. Then I've done various gradient adjustments to the sky to introduce some magenta to get rid of that horrible green color. And then I've got a vertical gradient here to brighten the right hand side of the image, and finished it up with a crop. And I think that does help to make the best of this image. It would be nice to have a really strong focal point, but actually the lines and the geometry of the shot do work very well. I'm not sure that it absolutely needs a strong focal point, and it's obviously a very beautiful morning view that probably, or evening view, that probably wasn't easy to achieve, because being on mountaintops at these times of days is always hard work. So well done, Alasdair, on putting in that extra effort, and thank you very much for sharing those images with me. It's given me a view of a couple of areas that I've never been to and would love to visit, so thank you very much.